Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ruth Rosen, who is a historian and journalist. Her most recent book is A World Split Open: How the Women's Movement Changed America. Formerly a professor at the University of California at Davis, she is now an editorial writer and columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. Ruth, welcome to Berkeley. Welcome back to Berkeley, I guess I should say. You got your doctorate here?
Yes.
And we'll talk about that maybe in a minute. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in New York.
And in retrospect, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
Oh, that's a hard one. I would say they were very, very conservative Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And they shaped my character by pretty much teaching me mainstream American political culture.
And when you were young, did you have any mentors that in school or elsewhere who also shaped or influenced your thinking?
Well, it turns out when they moved to a suburb of New York, by accident, I got to know a lot of kids, of red diaper babies and children of liberals. And those kids became my friends. And in some ways, they gave me a language for some of the social alienation, some of the political discomfort I felt with the United States by the time I was a teenager. So those kids became my mentors. I didn't know it at the time. I only in retrospect have found out what their parents' background was. But it turns out I was just attracted to them and got to know them.
And what about books? Did you read any books as a young person that even today stick in your mind, that changed your thinking in any way?
Interestingly, the book that I wrote a book review about year after year after year was on Harriet Tubman.
Mm-hmm. In high school, actually.
In elementary school, in junior high school, in high school again.
I see.
I kept reading more advanced biographies of Harriet Tubman. And what so impressed me was that anyone who had escaped the South would have the courage to go back so many times to free other people. So she became my very early heroine. And I think when I was in high school, the people who most influenced me were existentialist philosophers. And probably, I would say a lot of the literature by absurdists and by post-war literary people.
Where did you do your undergraduate work?
I was at the University of Rochester. And it had an extraordinary history department with people like Norman O'Brown and a lot of other people who you wouldn't necessarily think of as historians. They're really cultural critics. And so I became very immersed in history. And mainly cultural and intellectual history.
And it was there that you got the history bug, or did you come with it?
Yes, no, I was very, Hayden White was there. And he taught Western civilization. Probably from the first day that I took that course, I think I knew I was going to become a history major. I was very, very turned on to history. And
what in particular turned you on?
Well, I think I had been involved in the civil rights movement already in high school, and the war was really starting in Vietnam already. And I think I knew that I needed to understand the past in order to understand the present. And so it was vital. It felt essential to me.
How were you involved in the civil rights movement in high school?
Well, there were a group of us who were working in Harlem during the weekends. And we were canvassing, and we were working for CORE. And then in Rochester, I was working in the civil rights movement. So before the Gulf of Tonkin, which was my sophomore year in college, I already had the experience of being involved in an interracial movement and questioning authority in a big way, and questioning received wisdom. That was already part of my experience. I think the thing that really had the biggest influence on me, which I have to back up on, was the summer before I went to college, I went on the experiment in international living to Mexico. And this was the first time I had the opportunity to see the United States as other people saw the United States. It was like reading The Ugly American, but in real time. And I was very affected by the way in which Latin Americans, and Mexicans in particular, were viewing American foreign policy. So I entered college with that kind of radicalization, seeing the United States from an outsider's point of view, which I had never seen.
So when were you in college? What years? In the 60s?
63 to 67.
63 to 67. And so I guess the question becomes, beyond what you've already said, how did the 60s really affect you and change the direction of your thinking?
I think the civil rights movement set the pace because it taught me that you can change things, and it taught me that you can question received wisdom about race relations. And when the war began, I became very involved from the very beginning, from '64 on, in anti-war activity. And then in 1966-67, I lived in Italy for years studying government and political science. And that was a very radicalizing experience because I lived with Italians who did not speak English, who had been partisans in the Second World War. So I learned a lot of politics and European politics and comparative politics, living in Europe. And then when I came back, I was still very involved in the anti-war movement. And by then, I really felt like I was apart from the rest of the country. I felt I was part of a movement, and a movement that was against American sponsorship of war in Southeast Asia. So by the time I came to Berkeley to graduate school in '67, I was well into seeing myself as an activist. I was very devoted to nonviolent action, but I very much had an identity as a movement activist by then.
In the introduction to your book on the women's movement, you describe seeing a sign about a women's meeting to discuss women's issues. Tell us a little about that and how that changed the course of your thinking about what you might study and be interested in, both in terms of activism and academic research.
I was in the history department. I was working I was editing a magazine as a journalist on this campus. And I saw this little 3x5 card in the student union, and it said, "A women's group forming, all are welcome." And I thought, being older, being a graduate student, being a journalist, well, this is a good story. So I thought I'd go and I'd write a story. And I was really accustomed already to thinking of myself as somewhat special. I was the only woman in all my graduate seminars. I was used to having a certain amount of success and not seeing, I would not have thought of myself as discriminated against because of gender. And though I had been in the movement and in fact been discriminated against a lot, but I hadn't thought about it. It seemed normal. Everything seemed normal. And at that meeting, they said, you can write a story, but you have to participate. And in 2 hours, the kinds of questions that people raised, they raised very simple questions like, what in your life would you have done differently had you been a boy? What toys would you have played with that were different? And what big decisions got derailed because you were a girl? I had actually answers to those, which I had never known about or never thought about. And they were funny and they were amusing, but they were actually profound. In some ways, they were really paths I had not taken because I was a girl, and ways in which my parents had treated me differently because I was a daughter rather than a son. And I had never thought about that. So I began to ask questions, of course, being in a history department. What's the history of women? How have women reacted to such discrimination? And what's been the history of women? And I just became fascinated by all those questions. And that really led to me starting being among people who were spread out all over the country, introducing gender into historical studies.
And what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on prostitution. I was very interested in the experience of poor women. I was interested in urban history. I was interested in social history. And I was particularly interested in sexuality and gender. So it seemed like the ideal dissertation, finding out that there's actually a history to prostitution that hasn't always been the same. And
what was innovative or unique in the way you cut into this problem because of this emerging change in consciousness?
I think what was different about it was I was not only studying how the United States at the beginning of the 20th century had made prostitution illegal, but I was looking at how the prostitutes themselves responded to it, how they viewed it. I was also paying close attention to the fact that middle-class women had been instrumental in ending legal prostitution or de facto tolerated prostitution, and that their perspective was quite different than the working-class women and poor women who were the prostitutes. So it was a class analysis, it was a gender analysis, and it was also an ethnographic study of the prostitutes, their humor, their culture, and how they viewed their own work. I think probably most innovative from a feminist point of view, which now it's aha, of course, but it was a big deal at that moment, was to think of prostitution as a form of work, something that allows you to survive. I mean, we saw rape and we saw prostitution only as in its sexual dimension, but we didn't see prostitution as work. We didn't see rape as a physical assault as well as a sexual act.
You mentioned that you actually were a journalist in graduate, so this is another strand that we actually haven't picked up in your life.
Right.
That is I guess the scribe who gives us an account of the ongoing story, and on the other hand, the historian who looks at the backstory, so to speak, or the story that comes before what we know now. Talk to us a little about those different ways of seeing the world.
I think when I was at Berkeley working as a journalist, I actually considered pursuing a career as a journalist. But in some ways, it was the excavation of women's past experience that was so intellectually exciting. It was such a mind-boggling experience to rethink all of history by thinking about half the population that hadn't been talked about, that it became in some ways a no-brainer for me. I decided, no, I'm going to become a historian and study women's past. And so in some ways, I veered off into history. But up until that moment, they were really competing careers for me. And I found it extremely interesting to write as a cultural critic, to write about the war, to write about the anti-war movement, to chronicle what was happening, to analyze what was happening. But history has a claim on my heart. I mean, I love history, and I still do.
And I want to talk a little about this most recent book, which is a history of the women's movement and how it changed the United States, and implicitly how it is changing the world, or will change it. Not to say there hadn't been women movements elsewhere, but it really succeeded, I think, here in a way that was quite distinct, not without struggle. But I guess what I wanted to have you reflect on is this notion that in doing this history, you in a way are an implicit actor in the history that's being told. So what you are describing is not how women were changed in the past, but how they were changed during a period when you were changing. Tell me a little about that problem. Is it a problem, or does it make the work more satisfying?
Well, it has its advantages and its disadvantages. As a historian, if you have to leap into a past when you weren't alive, you have to imagine it in such a really profound and evocative way. And you have the advantage of distance, but you have the disadvantage of not knowing the texture of how it felt. The advantage of having lived through it is you know when you have evoked something and it feels right. The disadvantage is that you may not have the analytical distance. And I knew that I had the advantage of knowing how to evoke the texture if I could figure out how to write about it. What I began to realize was my analytical skill, and I suppose in some ways having been part of it gave me some perspective on it, was that I began to realize this book was really about how American political culture had shaped the women's movement and how in turn the women's movement had affected American political culture. And once I realized that, then I felt like the analytical schema is in place. Now I have to figure out where the stories that I know will fit into that. And that took me years to realize that, because the women's movement came out of this culture, this society. It didn't spring out of something that doesn't exist. And I had to explain that. And once I realized that, then it was a matter of telling stories, in some ways as a journalist. And then I think my proximity to those experiences gave me some advantages. But on the other hand, I had to go into the archives, I had to interview hundreds of people in order to really know what I was talking about, because I'm only one person, I only experienced one movement in one particular locality, and it was the whole country, and many generations.
In telling this story, a major emphasis, or one of the major themes, is really the change in women's consciousness. And the book begins with the feminine mystique. Tell us a little about that and how that set the stage for all that was to follow.
Well, in many ways, that book, even though it did not reflect all women's lives, it had a profound effect on people who read it, because it described an archetype, an ideal archetype of the 50s of a woman who lived only to be a mother, only who lived through her husband and her children, who had no fundamental identity of her own. And although it doesn't reflect the working class women, it doesn't reflect minority women's experience, it did reflect what the ideal was of the 1950s, which was already crumbling when Betty Friedan's book came out in 1963. And I argued in the book that there was a whole generation of middle-class educated girls coming of age whose parents' expectations was that they were going to go to college. And they, in turn, feared becoming like that stereotype. They feared becoming an imprisoned mother and housewife who would not use their education. And they are, in fact, the first, really, the stomping grounds. They create the noise, and they create they politicize these issues rather than just living them out a different kind of life than their mothers. They politicize it and, in effect, create the women's movement. They form the shock troops of the early young women's movement. But there's an older generation that comes out of old left politics and out of the labor union activity who form the older women's groups. And they're the ones who found NOW and other groups that, while they're less noisy, they're less countercultural, they don't come out of the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement quite so directly. They come out of the labor union. They come out of the Communist Party. They come out of leftist organizations from the war and pre-war period.
Yeah, we'll talk about that dynamic in a minute, because it's an interesting dynamic as you go through the 60s. But I'm intrigued by this moment of change in consciousness, because in the preface to the book you describe teaching at Davis and suddenly realizing that you had students who in a way were benefiting from a change of consciousness, but were not really aware of what it had been like before.
That's right.
And give us an account in a way of this fault line and what it was like before that some people in our audience may in fact not know.
Right.
And what it meant for a woman who was, say, at the top of her class, who got a BA, went on to a professional or graduate school, and the constraint on her opportunities.
I think the most important thing to look at before that fault line is that everything seemed normal. No matter what happened, it was the way life was. So if someone were raped, well, she'd be embarrassed, not talk about it. If someone were beaten by a husband, there was no language to describe it. If someone was discriminated against, in your case, in your hypothetical, well, that's just what happens. That's just life. You don't get a job, or if you're paid less, that's just the way it is. Or if you're not promoted, well, that's just the way it is. You have a dream and you can't make it because women aren't in that field, well, that's just the way it is. In other words, everything seemed normal. And moreover, and this is what I really talk about that I think is so important, there wasn't a language for all these, what I end up calling hidden injuries of sex. There wasn't a language. There was no language for sexual harassment. There was no language for domestic violence. There was no language for all these things. And what happened in the 1970s is that early activists in the women's movement began to name these injuries. One year after another, they took an issue after issue after issue and named them. By the time I came to that moment when I was talking with my several hundred students in my class, those things had been named. And I realized I was writing on the board all these things, and for my students, it was like, so what's the big deal? And I realized they did not know that people had been sexually harassed at work and thought, well, my fault, or bad luck, or that's just the way life is. That's life. That's what their mothers had told them. That's what they grew up knowing. That's life. Now people were saying, no, that's not fair. It's unjust. And moreover, I'm going to seek redress. And moreover, laws had been passed about every one of those injuries, about rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, discrimination, equal pay, all of these issues that have to do with both life within the home and at the workplace, which are the two major localities. And those two places were changed. People had to behave differently at home. They had to behave differently at work. Both men and women got new responsibilities and new rights. And that is the impact of the women's movement. Those students grew up knowing those things and taking those for granted, as well they should. But that's the history I wanted to evoke. I wanted people to understand there was a time before. There was a time before when my mother was sexually harassed when she was a worker, and she told me, if you ever get a job and you work and this happens to you, what you have to do is you have to just act in such a way that you don't encourage this. And the whole onus was on me. Mothers gave their daughters advice how to sort of fend off problems, but not how to get redress, not how to get justice, because they didn't know. And I wanted to give people a sense of this is the way life was before, sort of briefly and quickly in the beginning, and then to show what the real genius of the women's movement was to name things for which there was no language. And once you name something, you can cause a debate. Once you cause a debate, you can cause a policy debate. And then you can have a whole society arguing, is this fair? Is it just? And the fact is, in a democracy, you get lots of men saying, that's not fair. I hadn't thought about it before, but that's not right. And that's why the women's movement succeeded so well, not because women named it, but because there is a sense of Americans always asking, is something fair? That is an egalitarian ethic that we have in our society. Is that fair? No. Well, lots of men are fathers. They have daughters. They have sisters. They are not impervious to those questions. And once you ask those questions, you get a critical mass of men and women saying, that's not right. We ought to pass a law against that. We ought to create a guideline. We ought to have a voluntary statement about this is not acceptable behavior. And so then you start getting cultural, social, and in the most extreme cases, legal changes in rules of evidence and in admissibility, the ways in which courts operate and so forth. So you really get structural and institutional changes.
And you get different judges and different people.
You get different people.
That's who are actually making the law or arguing the cases. One of the points in the book that's quite striking is that this new generation of women in the 60s who were a key factor in the change in consciousness. Really, it was their experience in the movements, such as the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, where they suddenly realized that they had more to offer than typing the letters and going out to get the coffee. And that was a very important turning point, was it not?
It was important because, again, it goes back to the question, is this fair? These women, like the men, were some of the best and the brightest and most exciting and intellectually brave, in some ways, people of their generation. And they did extraordinary things, as the men did. But the work that they did was often devalued or not valued, and they were often marginalized within the movement. And yet, it was the freest place. If they had been outside the movement, and they had been at, say, 21, already married and a mother, they would have been more constrained, they would have had less freedom. So people expected the world within the movement. After all, these movements were about peace and justice and equality. And so it was bumping up against the contradiction of less equality than they would have liked, but a situation, in fact, that gave them more freedom than any other place might have given them. And so they began to push the limits. They began to ask for more responsibility. They wanted to be able to write manifestos. Some of the women, for example, who were doing incredible organizing work were angry and disappointed that the work that they did was not valued, even though it was really more important sometimes than the position papers that were just going onto the shelf that the men were writing. So it was also a question of the work they were doing.
So they saw in the movement the inequality they were experiencing, and then I guess from what you're describing, the next stage is really to say, hey, well, wait a minute, this is also going on at home in the family.
That's right.
And that is also a critical turning point.
And I think that didn't happen right away. That really happened more in consciousness-raising groups, because that was really difficult to see. After all, every woman is in a home by herself, and it's very hard. It's so normal to take care of people, that is the expected role, that it took women coming together in these small consciousness-raising groups, like the little group I joined, and watched people talk about, why am I particularly suited to wash the toilet bowls? What is it about my education that makes me perfectly suited for this? How come I'm expected to be involved in the movement and also hold down a job, take care of the baby, and also have dinner on the table? Why are we not sharing these jobs? Why is a movement that's dedicated toward equality and peace and justice, why are the women in this movement still playing these subordinate wifely roles. And don't forget, these women weren't in the movement in order to be wives. They were in it to be independent people who were activists. And they kept bumping up against this blurry identity. On one hand, they were girlfriends and wives. On the other hand, they were movement activists. And they didn't quite overlap perfectly. So I think it was in these consciousness-raising groups that people began to bristle and say, wait a minute, how come I have to do this? We're doing the exact same thing, or we're both graduate students, we're both movement activists, and how come I take the laundry, I do the dry cleaning, I get the shopping done, and I cook the meals? How come? Where is this written? Is it an 11th Amendment, a commandment? And just questioning again, and for people who are used to questioning received wisdom, this didn't take a long time. These were people who were used to questioning the American government's foreign policy in Southeast Asia, the American support of apartheid in the South, so legal apartheid. And so these were people who were used to questioning authority. And it didn't take long for them to question an amazing array of both legal and informal customs.
Now, one of the other dynamics in this change occurs in a way, you could say, from the push of the now generation. That is, this older generation who had worked in unions, who had worked in government and so on. And you're suggesting or arguing that a turning point came in the early days of the Kennedy administration when the newly elected President Kennedy did not deliver jobs to women in the new administration. And this led to the appointment of a commission to look at the status of women. Eleanor Roosevelt was named chairman, and that had unintended consequences.
Some of the
way.
biggest.
Yeah, and talk a little about this, because I think, as we were talking earlier at lunch, this is a theme that occurs, that you set up a formal body to explore a question, and it also is a way of changing consciousness.
Well, this is an object lesson. I don't know if I should publicize this, but if you give women a conference as a sop and you try to buy them off, this actually has revolutionary consequences. When Kennedy did that, he was, in effect, thanking women in the Democratic Party for having worked so hard for his election. He didn't, and of course he created a big cross-class and cross-race representative group of women from all over the country. Well, I don't think he meant to give birth to the women's movement, but that, in effect, is what happened. Because when that group started meeting, women of all minorities, backgrounds, and classes began to discuss what women's status was in the United States. And what they began to discover is whether you worked in a labor union, or you worked on an assembly line, or you were a corporate attorney, you were devalued and paid less. And that you also did all the work at home. And when you get women together, they talk about their lives. Now, I'm letting out a very important secret here. They talk about their lives. And I interviewed all these women who were on the commission on the status of women. I read all their transcribed interviews. This is what happened. They talked about their lives. And as they talked about it, they also collected a vast amount of data and demographic information that documented the widespread discrimination of women in all groups. So by 1963, when the report was issued by Eleanor Roosevelt, although it was very tepid and it talked about discrimination against women, the really important part of that conference, of that women meeting for those years, is that they spawned state commissions on the status of women, which in turn spawned county commissions on the status of women. And all of these groups collected that kind of data, which they then threw in the face of elected officials to change laws, to change public policy. And it had a very big impact. And those women were very savvy. They were older. They were already experienced speakers. They were experienced in organizing, labor unions, so forth. They were experienced in being part of the government, so they knew how to manipulate things. And without them, the women's movement could never have been successful. And without Kennedy having appointed that commission, I don't think the women's movement would have taken off quite like that. Remember, Betty Friedan's book comes out in '63, but Kennedy has to start this earlier. He starts this in '61. So this precedes this, and it's very important. And also, when every year there would be a conference of these state commissions, the government, the federal government, would ignore what these women wanted. And the women would get more and more irritated, more and more angry, much like the younger women were getting angry in the activist movements. And finally, in 1966, they say, forget about this. We're going to start an independent, outside the government women's movement to pressure the government. We can't act within the government anymore. It's not going to respond. Again, you know, it's women saying, bumping up against the limitations, in that case of liberal politics, in the movements against the more radical and left politics of the anti-war movement.
In this period that we're talking about, the women's movement and women who were concerned about these issues found an ally, strangely enough, in the reactionary chairman of the House Rules Committee, Howard K. Smith, in the sense that for really very reactionary kinds of reasons, he thought he would slow up the civil rights legislation by supporting the Equal Rights Amendment.
Well, it wasn't the Equal Rights Amendment. It was Title VII of the
yeah.
Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Okay.
And that is the legislation that actually is used by so many litigators to deal with sex discrimination, because what it did is added sex to race and national origins and said that discrimination against sex could not be acceptable.
And Smith was using
Yes.
that to destroy the...
But it passed.
It passed.
It was
yeah.
one of the great
Yeah.
unintended... history unfolds in very odd ways. And the 1964 Title VII became the really founding legislative basis on which sex discrimination cases would be taken to the courts.
What is the most important message, do you think, or is there one from this story of the women's movement in the 60s? Does some part of it stand out in your own mind that we haven't already covered, that helps us understand why history is important for a generation that may not have to go through all
Right.
that the people you're describing went through?
Well, I think people tend to think that major events are the issue. You know, this happened, that happened. But it's the story behind those events, the slow changes, what historians often call latent facts, things that change very gradually, that are really the big story. I mean, that slow naming of injuries throughout the 1970s really changed American society in profound ways. And what happened as the Commission on the Status of Women, while they were meeting, what they did slowly and gradually behind this, it's a story behind the report, behind the naming of the commission, had a tremendous impact, way out of proportion to the actual event. So there are many, or to put it another way, sometimes people tend to overlook the importance of social movements in changing society. I think the biggest thing that people ought to notice from the history of the women's movement is that it took two generations who came out of two very different experiences, but both based in social movements, movements that were very indigenous to American society. Mm-hmm. Both of them are social change movements. Mm-hmm. And older women and younger women who took those experiences and then began to hold society accountable and ask the question, what about women now? Mm-hmm. I think the importance of social movements in creating and making social change is often overlooked by people.
I know that you've thought a lot about the global dynamic. How do we see this kind of phenomena changing the world in a way? Talk a little about that and what you see as pivotal in awakening women's consciousness all over the world about the issues that women want to raise about their rights.
Well, I think this has been an amazing experience. Starting in the early 70s, Western women began really knocking on the door of the UN and saying, hey, we have to have some international women's conferences. And finally the UN gave in and said, we'll have an International Women's Year in 1975. And again, it was a kind of buying off these women, let them have their conference. They'll have it in Mexico City, it'll be 1 year, it'll be over. Well, the first thing those women did in Mexico was extend it into a decade. And the second thing they did is they started talking about their lives. And I don't mean the formal delegations from the governments, but the parallel non-governmental groups. And they discovered a lot of differences about which women fought, but they also discovered two really big similarities. One, that women everywhere were poor, and secondly, that women experienced all kinds of brutality and violence in their lives, different sorts, some of which were sanctioned by governments, most of which were sanctioned by custom. And then those conferences continued in 1980 in Copenhagen, 1985 in Nairobi, and then 1995 in China. Now, during the course of all those years, what happened as a result, again, of conferences, the conferences were just catalysts. In between, these networks grew, and they began to talk about gendered issues everywhere. And they also encouraged women to identify what are your gender issues. So women in Africa talked about fuel and water being women's issues. Or women in some countries said dowry deaths are our issues. In other countries they said it's genital mutilation, it's honor deaths. And people were beginning to identify different kinds of brutality, different kinds of violence to the body. This ultimately had an impact, a cumulative impact. By 1992, women around the world were instrumental in getting the UN to expand its view of human rights. And violence against girls and women was passed by the UN General Assembly as being a violation of women's human rights. Now that's a very, very big thing, because it means that all kinds of customs were now being described as illegal and unacceptable to a civilized nation. Doesn't mean it was going to stop it, but it was creating a reference point, a moral reference point. That meant that beating wives was unacceptable, harming people, genital mutilation, dowry deaths, all kinds of violence to the body was unacceptable. And then in 1994 and 95, when there was a conference on development and on population control, again women came to the UN conferences and said, look, we have another way of looking at population control. If you educate women and give them control over their own bodies, you cut population immediately and you improve the standard of living. This is an alternative view. And they also provided an alternative view to development. They said instead of creating vast hydroelectric industries that change the natural ecology and the human ecology, the social ecology, give women small grants like the Grameen Bank and allow women to use those small loans in order to create small enterprises. This has been very successful. The loans have been paid back, and it's now a I think it's very much part of the international agenda to consider that you go in and you think about development in a different way. And you don't necessarily assume that people should industrialize in 5 years and that that's the best way to go about development. So once you add gender to international issues and you think about globalization even in gender terms, you start looking at things as global traffic in women and children. You start noticing that women and children are the poorest people everywhere in the world. Suddenly, it was like history when I first started history. Once you put women into the picture and you say, yes, I'm looking through both eyes, I'm going to notice, for example, men and women, you, for example, notice that the problems of refugees are largely the problem of women and children. Most men have been killed or they're in combat. They tend not to be the refugees unless they're very elderly. So then you have the right, you provide the right provisions and you give the right relief to the right people. So it really has had an impact. By talking about gender and globalization, it has challenged a lot of policies.
What I'm hearing you say is then, as a historian, it's important to tell the story, to know the elements of the story, because the story is still unfolding. And by knowing that past story, you can affect the story as it's being written.
Well, you encourage everyone, whatever their field, to look back and to say, look, we didn't think about this until these ideas were introduced by women. Now that we're looking at this new problem, how would we look at this problem differently if we added women to the equation? Would we pursue the same policy, or would we slightly alter it? Or would we dramatically alter it because we're thinking now about women being part of the problem, involved in the problem? By knowing how much was changed in the past, you may think about the future problems in a different way.
The last women's conference was held in China, which is not a place that necessarily had women's equality on the top of its agenda. But having the conference there actually changed things, as you've realized in later trips. Tell us a little about that.
Well, it really did. I mean, I didn't expect that, but in fact, the president of China, in his address to all these people, 30,000 women had come from all over the world, said that the fundamental state policy was gender equality. Mm-hmm. And when the conference was over, even though the Chinese government had tried to subvert it in every conceivable manner, even moving it to this remote area in Huairu, nevertheless, the educated women of China took that statement and began to use it as a patriotic obsession almost. As patriotic women, we need to achieve gender equality. Well, we need rape crisis centers. We need shelters for domestically beaten women. We need women's studies programs. And they've gotten a lot simply by using the language that the president had to use against the government itself, and in the name of being patriotic women. And it turns out that actually every country that has held international conferences like this there's been a ripple effect. You think that these conferences don't have an impact, but in fact, you look at them and they have. Because the government has to put on a good face, the international cameras are whirring, the lights of the journalists and the cameras are on the government, and whether it's the Olympics or an international women's conference, people are peering into your society, and you have to present yourself in your best light. And it does have an impact.
And a recent opinion page column that you wrote for the Chronicle points to what you've just said is even true on the United States, that we are now engaged after the events of 9/11 in a war in Afghanistan. And lo and behold, our president, President Bush, is now talking about women at the table in the negotiations for the new government in Afghanistan. And his wife has gone on the radio.
These are unprecedented events.
Yeah.
I mean, if Hillary Clinton had done this in the absence of women walking around in blue burqas, being invisible, she would have been pilloried. But in this moment, Afghanistani women became icons of the oppression that the Taliban wrought on Afghan society. And as the iconic image, when our Secretary of State made such a statement as the rights of Afghanistani women will not be negotiable, that is an incredible statement. We've never had a foreign policy that included the rights of the rights of women in another country will not be negotiable as a result of some kind of a peace treaty. I mean, whoever heard of such a thing? This is unprecedented. Now, whether that will really change the lives of women in Afghanistan, who knows? Whether it will change anything for American women, who knows? But it's been said and it can't be taken back. And it does take on a life of its own. And I think what struck me when I heard those words come out of Secretary of State Colin Powell's mouth, I realized this was a historic moment. And I realized those words are going to come back to haunt some future president. Because at some point, some president, maybe it will be George W. Bush or some other president, women will be saying around the world, how dare you sell weapons to Saudi Arabia? Look at the way women are treated. What do you mean you're protecting the democracy of Kuwait when women can't even vote in that country? The democratic rights of women will now be at issue when American foreign policy is being discussed, and it won't be able to be taken out.
And interestingly enough, I don't know if you know this, but in a recent episode of West Wing, that is exactly what the press secretary...
I wrote about that in that column. C.J. Craig, who's the communications expert, dissolves into tears as she thinks about the idiocy of America selling weapons to this country, this mythical country in the Gulf, which beats women, stones them, shoots them, and so forth. And she dissolves into tears, and she's enraged at the proposition that women's rights are not part of American foreign policy. And that happened virtually the week I was writing that column, so I included it, because it struck me as something that had entered popular culture already, quite amazingly so.
Let's pick up this thread in your life story, which is the thread of being a journalist. You've actually gone back to that and are now the opinion page writer for the Chronicle, and also a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. And I'm curious as to what you see as becoming part of the public discourse in that way, how that role contributes to the changing of consciousness on public issues. What is the importance of that kind of role in our society?
Well, I actually see a distinct difference when I'm involved. For 11 years, I was a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. And it was interesting that the editor there allowed my column to be in the middle of the page or on column left, because I wrote on such a variety of issues that weren't standard, they weren't particularly liberal, they were gendered issues, they were cultural issues, and so I had a distinct difference. And I'm noticing now on the editorial board, I will choose issues that we should write about and offer myself to write about them, and about things that people wouldn't think about because they don't know about them. And so I've written a whole series of things on Afghan women and the need for them to be at the table and what's going on internationally, what kinds of moves are being made to make sure that they have security and protection and democratic rights in some newly formed government. And there are a zillion women's issues that I will suggest all the time as items that should be editorialized about, that I think my colleagues, as receptive as they are to those ideas, just it may not have occurred to them. And that's what, and I'm the only woman on the editorial board, and I can see the difference. But there's other differences. I will often suggest historical issues, because I'm a historian as well. I will also often affect various issues that have to do with peace and war, because I've been concerned with peace and war all my life now, all my adult life. So there's issues like the militarization of space, which is not what someone would think I would write about, but actually I found very, very important and very scary. So I actually have written about a lot of things that go back and draw upon my whole life experience, my whole academic experience, my whole intellectual experience. And there's no question that my voice brings certain kinds of obsessions and concerns that other people wouldn't offer up in paper.
Now, it sounds to me like the goal is to write something so that somebody will read it, or many people will read it and say, hey, I hadn't thought of that.
Exactly.
So what does it take to do that? In other words, what is the art in that kind of writing?
That is exactly it. The goal of every column and every good editorial should be, you have an educated reader reading that and they say, I never thought of it that way, or I never even knew about this. Either you want to surprise them with information that they don't know about, so you've educated someone and they feel like they've taken something away, or you want to talk about something that's very familiar, but turn it around so that people are looking at it in a new way. That is a tremendous art, and it really is not an easy thing to do. You've got to just do the same thing you do when you're a good teacher. You take someone by the hand and you take them through familiar territory, and then you show them it can be looked at in a new way. And in doing this, you have to be yourself, right? And words have to be your instrument for making the point that you find naturally. I'm putting words in your mouth here, but I want to get out of you what the creative moment is in this process. I think everyone will tell you that when you write a column, getting into it and getting out of it are the two most difficult things. And whenever I start something, I want to have some shock value to the reader. I want to grab the reader's attention and say, I want to show you something. I want to ask you a question or startle you with some kind of a statement so that you'll right away be interested in what I'm talking about. And I want to evoke things so that you'll follow my story and you'll come to see things in a new way, even if you don't agree with me at the end. So sometimes I'll be Socratic and I'll just say, I'll ask a question. Why is this so? And someone will immediately say, I didn't even know that was the case, or I hadn't thought of it that way. So you really have to figure out a zillion different ways of addressing the reader in your own voice, with your own personality, with your own quirks, your own tics, your own ways of reaching people. And some way you have to find words that really reflect that personality and that intellectual experience. And that's not easy. You can veer off and sound too analytical, too academic. And the biggest problem with academics who write op-ed pieces is they're only analytical. They don't reach out and show the person that they're also caring about the issue. You've got to really show someone that you care about the issue. Why should someone else care if you don't? And so in some ways you're revealing a compassion or concern, something, and it somehow has to be expressed through the verbs and the nouns that you pick.
And I think you told me earlier that writing an opinion page for the LA Times made you a better writer of history.
Yes,
what
much
did
better.
you mean by
well, I had a good, tough editor who criticized me a lot and taught me a lot about writing, a good copy editor who took out every unnecessary word. So when I wrote this book, The World Split Open, I edited it down over and over and over and over again. I became that critical copy editor. I put it down and came back to it, looked at it over and over again, and I read it as a reader, and I thought, is this of interest? Am I glazing over myself? Am I bored? If I'm boring myself, my goodness. I really wanted it to be evocative. I wanted to learn how to tell stories well, and I wanted to incorporate analysis in a kind of a seamless way that wouldn't pop out and say, hey, guess what, now I'm telling you what it means. I wanted it to be implicit rather than so explicit.
And a good example of this, in preparation for this interview, I read a column that you wrote on terror, in which, because terror is such an important word, as is terrorism now after 9/11, in which you told us and reminded us of how terror enters into people's normal lives. Yeah, in their ordinary lives.
That's right. And I use my own example of when I get off work and I walk through dark streets, and the fear that I often feel if it's very, very dark and unlit, and the kind of terror which people feel on this campus at night, in fact, walking around, and what people feel who are fearful of their children getting bullets thrown at them in drive-by shootings. I mean, people have a lot of terror in this society without terrorism. I want to remind people there's a level of terrorism that we have already accepted as normal, which is not gratifying and not wonderful, not a great statement about our society, but nevertheless it's there.
So in a way, words and this platform become an opportunity for people to see things in a new light, to see them clearly, but also for many people to see them so they can see connections that they might not have seen.
Right. And it seems to me that writing for a newspaper over those years truly changed me as a historian, because in some ways I unlearned what my academic training had taught me, which was to be more wooden, more analytical, less evocative. And since I was already so well trained as an academic, what I really needed to do was to have the training to be a writer, to learn to the craft of writing. And I'm still learning it. It's quite a difficult craft to pick the right word, to make something a picture in someone's mind so they can see what you're seeing. Very difficult.
If students were to watch this interview and they wanted to extract a lesson from your life, this odyssey that you've shared with us, what advice might you offer them?
Well, when I was about 16 or 17, I read about living an examined life, examining the assumptions that you live by, examining the meaning of your life, giving meaning to your life by taking life seriously, taking projects seriously, by taking issues seriously. And I think that's what I've tried to do in my life, is live an examined life, constantly questioning what I believe, what I think, changing my mind, and being critical. And I think that's given me the greatest satisfaction. It hasn't felt like an empty life. It's felt like I've had a lot of fun, but I've also had a very serious life too. So I think living an examined life is really, to me, the lesson of my life.
And I guess history is also important in that equation.
History is certainly part of it, because you can't really think about the present and examine it without knowing how you got here. And that's true for every individual life as well as for collective life. Everyone needs to understand themselves, where they've been, how they came to be, how their parents, their life, their schooling, their education affected them. But people need to know how their culture and their society and their government has been formed. And that's important too.
Ruth, on that note, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and talk about your book and your journey. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.